One of the things that I've always maintained about, or not always, but it seems important to me about a painting, is the orientation of the viewer to the surface of the canvas, the corners, and the sense of the center of the canvas, of the center, which relates in turn to our own symmetry, our feeling of left and right, of course, and up and down. In looking at this Vermeer, one of the things that strikes me almost immediately in those terms is the fact that the head of the woman is, I think, dead center, or very close to it, if you consider the whole mass of it. Slightly below the midpoint in terms of up and down, but centered in terms of left and right. Now, the emotional meaning of centering, I think, is illustrated in this painting, because the sense of sort of gravity and dignity that this figure has is, I think, due to the fact that symmetry is played off against very active counter asymmetrical elements, those being the window on the far left and the window sill on the far left, and the window frame that projects into the middle area of the picture with a kind of force against the position of the head, and the drapery to the right, which pulls to the right of center, of course. That play and counterplay of left-right in relationship all across the middle section to the symmetry of the head in terms of left and right seems to me to have something to do with the kind of emotional impact of the painting as a whole. I'm thinking now of things that we have mentioned previously in talking about painting. The capacity that a responsive viewer has to move with the rhythms, to feel the rhythms of a painting, not in a passive way, but actively and almost physically. The empathetic power which sensitive observers have to ride with these forms as they move through space, and the need on the part of the artist, of course, in controlling that physical empathetic reaction is important. In the case of this painting, the variety of speeds of movement and the way these pulsations are made to either go slow, fast, to move in long continuities, followed by intermediate ones, by short ones, by other variations. The fact that your eye can move throughout this image, this painting, and find that sequential movement I'm now talking specifically about contours, is maintained with interest and control at every point, everywhere you look.
Kenneth, as I understood what you said, you were impressed with the symmetry working against the asymmetrical factors in the painting. This was the only point that I wanted to make, and I didn't mean to interrupt you now.
You were talking about the interplay. Well, now that you've mentioned that, of course, the whole figure, it's not just the head. The head is a kind of a focus, but the whole figure of the woman obviously has a symmetrical relationship. But when you mention that, it reminds me of a certain kind of facility in painting that I find very moving, and that is to take a direction, as in this case, the positive verticality of that figure, and then as against that felt force of the vertical, to play off a whole sequence, in the case of this image, of counter rhythms, as in the case of those curves, of very intricate and constantly controlled variations within that one framework of a direction, so that the curve of the head and the curve of the hair, the curve across the collar, the small golden variations within the black of the sleeve, the little curve at the back of her, the longer continuities of curve, and the curve of her neck in relationship to the curve of her back, the relative straightness of the bodice, that constant elaboration on themes, in this case mostly curve themes, within the dominant framework of a direction, is one of the things that good artists do, it seems to me. This, of course, is carried on also in terms of the shadow that relates to, that is placed directly above her head.
I wonder if what the remarks you were making are relative to the ideas that I have in mind that seem to be to relate to what you're saying, which is that he works with the rigidity, which is almost predictable in the sense of it being apparent. The play of the very strongly centrally placed figure working against the left and the right, which are so much in contrast. I wonder if this is a continuation then, talking about the play of the rigid against the asymmetrical, to speak about the very positive tripartite organization that is in the painting. It's one of the, aside from an example in 20th century painting or a triptych from rather early Italian painting, it's one of the prime examples, I think, of where you get the artist working with as strong an example of the tripartite organization. And by that, I mean that the composition is divided by very strong verticals, the curtains running nearly from top to bottom on the right side, the curtains plus the casement of the window and the lower part, or rather the upper part of the chair, make a division on the left side, in which we could say that the composition is divided, the central part being the dominant area, and it is divided by the area to the right, the drapery, making far less interest than the area on the left in terms of variation of tone. We get only the greens on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side we have subdivisions of value plus shape interest, which counteract the right-hand side. I would think of the left side, however, as being subdominant and the right side as being minor in such a subdivision. The painter here has centered our interests in such a way that he makes a division running through the middle of the composition, having then a side to the left and a side to the right. And in my opinion, the side to the right with the drapery does not make as many demands on me in one way as the subdivision on the left-hand side. In another way, it's almost a contradiction because he makes new demands and different demands, and I'm wondering if this balance of working one thing against another, as in this case, a large area of the greens here where there are a variety of linear changes plus configurations which are repeating motifs that are found elsewhere. I wonder if that doesn't make a strong impression in terms of its initial importance, and then it seems to fade, or rather is superseded by the interest that the left-hand side takes, which does not have the swinging, sweeping curves in it, running from top to bottom. The curves seem to be only at the top and only at the bottom. We have to move out of that section, moving over into the area to the center before we get the repetition of the curves. The way I read it is to read then the center division with the figure and the blank wall in back of her as being dominant, and the area to the right, the drapery, as being minor, the area to the left, including the casement of the window, to be subdominant. I think the interesting change takes place in that the drapery makes immediate demands on us, being the longest and most unbroken lines in the composition. The tone of the green is very close to the tone in the sleeves and bodice of the lady, as well as the configurations are on a smaller scale, but not only relate to her in terms of the diamond formations that we see, but if we look into the window and the casement, we find that in the upper part there are variations of this in the mullioned window itself.
That thing you just mentioned about the repetition of motifs continues in more ways than one throughout this thing. In some cases, as you mentioned, it's more or less arbitrarily organized within drapery, but it occurs also either diamond shape or wedge shape in the what do you call those things? No, not the mullion. I see the mullion. It's in the chair, but in those small hinges in the window. It's repeated also there. And in another way, it's repeated in certain larger forms. I'm talking now about a kind of a wedge shape, which can be seen in terms of the red curtain on it also occurs down there in that drapery. But in a larger way, the red curtain on the left and the large green curtain on the right, also in a sense. Well, what we're getting at, I think, is that in all good paintings, there is an incredible kind of unity and affinity between the little parts and the big parts. And the device of repetition of shape is one of those means. Repetition of shape in different variations and different sizes is one of those ways whereby artists can produce a kind of continuity that sustains the picture from one end to the other.
I think we're in absolute agreement that the artist uses his concern, or not uses his concern, but rather has his concern for elemental expression or concern for the principles in order to give greater meaning to the painting. Specifically, we have a lady here who is reading a letter. The whole atmosphere of the room is such that it seems to be quiet and conducive. She doesn't seem to be having any distractions either within the room or outside the room, and the window is open. There appears to be no distractions. What I find particularly interesting in this painting is that the artist manages to convey this sense of quietness or placidity in terms of the natural setting, the representational values. On the other hand, he does such extreme things in upsetting this, almost guaranteeing that it cannot happen. For instance, the wall in back of the opened window and the lady is partially obscured by the curtain and the window itself, as well as the lady, and we think of it as a rectilinear shape, probably repeating the rectangle of the canvas itself. And it may, at first glance, seem to lack interest in shape compared to the other ones. But we find out that he has managed to subdivide it or break it up in so many interesting ways that when you begin to follow some of the subdivisions, it really impresses you that he manages to hold on to this sense of order and placidity that I referred to originally. I'm thinking of how he breaks the contour in these larger divisions, but this whole thing seems to be broken to begin with in a shape device, which is usually characterized by two straight lines at a right angle, then an opposite side turning into a curve. We get variations of this, for instance, in the window itself here, and then within this shape, it begins, as in here, to become very complicated in terms of a motif which can be picked up in different places.
While you're talking about that shape, there's something going on there that seems to me very important, and that has to do with the way these spaces breathe, the vertical of the window as it projects into that space, and the space made by that vertical edge with the contour of the woman's forehead and nose and breast and hand and letter, as those active forms roll down there, working against that rectilinear shape, seems to set up a certain kind of tension, but without the clutter. If you look at that whole shape you've been talking about, the shape of the wall, it has a kind of breathing quality about it, and of alternations of tension and relaxation, of open spaces and dense spaces. In fact, wherever you look in this painting, you never find a sense of awkwardness or clutter. You move freely. If we're now just talking about the linear rhythms, they are all articulate in the sense that nothing interferes with anything else, and yet they're very exciting. But there is a kind of sustained clarity and purity about the way these forms work together, making these different kinds of tension, relaxation. You were talking about the vertical division, and mentioning that it's possible to feel a counter rectilinear element that works horizontally. And I feel that too in terms of the position of the window on the left, of that strong light value, and then a kind of mass of light on the wall to the right of the woman, and then a certain sense of that continuity in the, or is it? I'm not so sure that it is in the green curtain on the right. I have a feeling that it stops at the edge of that curtain. But anyway, I think there is a kind of felt rectangle including these light elements that acts as a counter to the vertical. Is that the same thing you're talking about? Yeah, okay.
How impressed are you by what I was referring as the implication here of that? Does it exist for you at all?
It does not exist for you.
Oh, I see. The vertical segmentation is obvious compared to what I think happens in the horizontal divisions. I think they are, in general, more of an implied nature. But I do feel that if we can accept the repetition of the image as constituting a sense of the horizontal and through the central part of the composition, the image in the mirror of the lady who is reading, it's not a mirror, the image in the window glass, we have a reflection of her face so that we get a repetition of similar configurations which make for me a strong horizontal, although an implied one. But we have below there immediately the important rug on the table as well as the axis of the table, which reads as a horizontal. My question is, do we have to go all the way to the top of the painting and have the unbroken curtain rod before we get a repetition of a horizontal that we could reasonably expect him to use? For instance, we have them in the lead of the window, all of them operating as horizontals. I feel that there are certain creases in the drapes which may look very casual, but we can't accept them as casual. For instance, we know these are not casual, they're actually repetitions. I find one in particular over here, which seems to me to be on a level with this point over here, as well as this curve over here, which relates to it, that makes, by implication, however, a strong horizontal movement for me.
Don't you feel that all the good paintings are constantly interlaced with those implied unities? That this is a kind of another structural level of a painting. There is the overt, the more obvious divisions or linear patterns that have to do with contours. And then there are those others that are less related to contours and more related to direction, or any kind of repetition that makes the eye move from like to like, is likely to create that sense of a substructure. Is it too early to talk about the space in this painting?
I wonder if we could continue talking about implied linear rhythms. The ones that we've referred to now have been mainly angular, and I feel that there is one which gives such a twisting, turning, writhing kind of implied continuity that going back to what I said before about the paradoxical contrast of the strong opposition of axes in the background that represents, in essence, the wall itself and how it is subdivided into other shapes through shadows and overlapping. I find, along with this, almost equally strong, a continuity of line which follows in such a way up through the drapery that I have several choices in here whether I want to follow this configuration, which is in essence, I think, a repetition of the kind of stepped effect here, or whether I could go up this way and swing over and then from an implied, because I find out that this business here relates to this shape here, so that it is possible for me to make a jump or a very strong movement there. If I follow that down, I find that this movement, which bisects the composition, is an erratic series of conflicting curves.
Well, you're on that subject of the counter movement, not only a linear way, but in a spatial way. The path you just described also involves a kind of back and forth in space, doesn't it? That is, the curtain on the left-hand side, the red curtain, projects out, then goes back to the vertical drapery of it as it hangs over the window and over the window and is behind it. Then, in a sense, you move out to the figure again, taking up this linear thing, which by now has become a spatial writhing, so that from the figure then onto the rug, and those convolutions in the rug, down then along the apples, and then picking up, once you get started on these curvilinear flows of the thing, then the two big curves in the curtain also participate, and the bowing out of that curtain, the kind of sense of a projection in it, is also tied up with the bowing out in the curtain on the left-hand side, and with certain ins and outs in the rug on the table.
as I look at this and begin to try to interpret the spatial order of the painting in terms of thrusts and possibly cantilevering, as in the window as it goes into the room, the projections, the concavities and convexities, all these to be felt or to be thought of as relating to space. I wonder how I am to best accept the fact that the reds are on one side of the composition and that the majority of actions in terms of space are on the left side of the composition too. I'm trying to find something that will counteract this, which has to do on the right side of the composition.
We're not talking about space, about ins and outs, about those planes that turn one way and another, roundnesses, ins and outs. I'm assuming that the fundamental space concept of this painting is founded on a preoccupation with locating volumes in space with a kind of possible clarity or movement around the volumes. That is, that the figure of the woman exists with an adequate sense of actual space between her and the wall, and that the concept of this articulation of space has to do with a certain fullness of what is the word I want? Displacement. The volumes having a certain requirement and having an adequate space in which to exist. That the apples, the folds of the rug, the location of the table, the position of the chair, its plane in relationship to the plane of the window, the facet of the wall, the location of the cloth on the right-hand side. One in imagination can, in a sense, move behind that cloth. That has to do with what you were talking about, of this answering. It is perfectly clear that the ins and outs on the left-hand side are much more intricate. And as far as that aspect is concerned, those 2 points, the rising projection of the rug on the table and the downward turn of the red cloth above, and the space that sort of leaps between those two, and then the intricate ins and outs between those 2 points, in relationship to the figure on the right, seems kind of the key to that active aspect of the thing. I'm curious if you feel the space behind that curtain on the right.
I wonder if the sense of opposition or contrapposto in the figure itself, I read it as essentially a vertical, and yet there are counter oppositions of the head and neck seemingly moving against the waist. Even the torso comes out seemingly on the lower part, so that it's more like an S curve rather than a vertical or having the static quality of a truncated or pyramidal form. Do any of the movements in this figure, in terms of subdivisions that might oppose themselves as essentially being curves, are any of these of a nature that seem to move more to the right than to the left? I keep finding that I want to allow for compensation for all the interest that's to the left in order to find what is counteracting that to the right.
You said that. I think I would just would agree with you about that. I wish I could say what's on my mind about the volumes of this thing, and you were mentioning the rhythm down the front of the figure, reading that as an egg-shaped mass, and the in relationship to the hands and the piece of paper. I find that very beautiful. That sort of massiveness of the head, the progression down the front of her, and then finding that kind of cave-like or valley-like enclosure that the hands and the paper make in terms of the mass of the head. And in reading the definitions of space in there, then looking back at the window and the point of the window, that right angle in relationship to this hollowed out section that I've talked about. The hollows and bumps of this thing having to do with the thing you mentioned earlier on the far right-hand side of that recessive area in the curtain, having also to do with the projection of the red curtain on the left-hand side, and the the rounded mass of the rug, and then the indentations that are cut into that, as well as the roundnesses and indentations of the apples. I think this thing is as clear as it could possibly be in every part in terms of that definition of space. It is I said this before, the clarity of that spatial order that makes it seem so artful. By the way, it is a very formal picture, isn't it? It has that quality of artfulness in the extreme, it seems to me.
I think that the painting has a deceptive clarity as well as a deceptive simplicity about it. Maybe the clarity isn't deceptive, but the simplicity is. I think that the layman, in looking at this, might only concern himself with what meets the eye, so to speak, that the lady is here by a window reading a letter. Any kind of investigation shows that there's almost no shape, no tone, no direction that isn't in there through a kind of intuitive sense of what is right for the composition.
An element in this that we haven't touched on has to do with light and the use of light. It has a quality of being infused with light, relating, of course, to modeling, relating somewhat to Vermeer's technique, which, in a sense, antedated Impressionism. If you look at this reproduction or look at the Vermeer closely, you see that he applied the paint in very small dots in certain places, with thicker paint than in other places, and those tiny little vibrating dots are obviously put there to catch the light and to create a sense of vibration. Although that of course is just a detail of the technique. But the way the light is used in this case, one can talk about the light in terms of the light and dark, the distribution of lights and darks, so the same complete control and ordering of the elements, the weights of light and dark are clear in the thing. But the light is also used as a plastic element. That is, it is modulated and moved about in a very arbitrary way, in order to define space and to fill the whole canvas with a sense of a light that comes from within. It has, in a sense, two meanings: that sense of a sort of glowing from within, and the other having to do with the plastic organization. By plastic, I mean the manipulation across the surfaces and into space of the different forms.
Part of my worry before was the fact that it didn't seem to be strongly enough stated by me that the right side of the composition is minor and does not take importance over other parts. And you're mentioning the light at this point makes me more aware than I probably have been at any one point, that the light is moving from left to right, and this direction of the movement from left to right makes the right side of the composition more important than it does at any time if I exclude this consideration of light and the movement of light.
In terms of the vitality of the painting, it is interesting now you mentioned that the movement, the sense of an actual flow of light bathing the canvas from left to right, makes the location of all those things to the left even more dramatic, doesn't it? It is that counter relationship, one thing to the other. One of the important conventions in painting has to do with maintaining the reality, a sense of the reality of the picture plane. And many people, in looking at a Renaissance concept like this, tend to think of the picture plane as simply a transparent window. And in one sense, I think there was something of that attitude in the Renaissance about this marvelous creation of perspective and other devices that made it possible to create a sense of volume and distance on a two-dimensional surface. But the artists nevertheless managed, in spite of the fact that they are dealing with projections into space and masses existing with atmosphere around them, somehow or another managed to maintain a sense of the real two-dimensional thing upon which the picture is created. In the case of this Vermeer, I think he achieves that sense of the surface by balancing the things that go back with the things that move forward in such a refined way that together the recessions and the projections evoke a kind of stasis or or resolution that, in a sense, is the picture plane. The technical thing that you mentioned of utilizing equal detail in the distant parts and the fore parts. Also, the whole technique, in a sense, is evocative of the surface. This rather smooth, fine, elegant kind of mark making on the board. Is it the board? I'm not sure. In any case, the kind of uniformity of the technique tends to make that plane be evident.
I think I should have said in the beginning, Kenneth, that this painting gives me a particular sensuous pleasure, and looking at the shapes that are in essence as purely abstract as anything in 20th century painting or sculpture. I'm referring now to something in terms of a sequence which is remarkable for its richness of contrast, and that is the center part, which includes the drapery and comes down by the division of the casement of the window and the frame itself, and carries through in the swinging lines of the fruit on the table, and then comes up on the line of the drapery on the right-hand side. I find one of the pleasures of this painting for me is for being able to contrast that. It's almost as though I isolate it as a pure abstract shape, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to relate that to the rectilinear form of the drapery, and then going almost immediately in this series of relationship to the extreme side, where there is an elongation of something that is so almost mechanical in the repetition of the intervals, which in their overall form make a very clear, concise, rectilinear form. All of these, of course, having in general a vertical axis which relates to what you were saying in the beginning, the placement of the figure in the center, which of course is an upright figure.
You mentioned something, and might as well introduce a note of argument in this. You referred to that as a rectangle, whereas in fact it is the curve of on the right-hand side. This in a sense goes back to that kind of the arbitrariness of the vertical tripartite segmentation. The fact is that is of the quality of that thing is that grand curve, and it is that curve in relationship to the shorter one of the red on the left-hand side, plus the straight-edged angularity of the window as it projects into that space, plus the true verticality of the sash of the edge of the window, that contributes to the richness of this. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think I do, and I don't think it's an argument. When I read the left-hand side as being rectilinear, it's a long, narrow shaft, with of course the curves at the top, which I cannot possibly separate or isolate. But I feel that this is a complement, as it were, to the green shape on the right, which again has a strong vertical axis, but which is composed of strong curves within it, so that if there is a feeling of the force of the curve in the upper left, there is also a reciprocal feeling of a curve in the whole axis of the green on the right. In the beginning, you made the point that I think has to be made in the beginning, and that is we have an example of the artist accepting the challenge of what are, in many instances, the limitation of the symmetrical because of the encasement and the static nature of symmetry. And he uses that as a kind of a fulcrum on which he balances interplays and contrasts that work against the symmetry. In other words, having established that which is alike in the sense of weights, he immediately begins to show the dissimilarities within not only weights but lines. And up to this point, I haven't thought of it. I've thought of it, but I haven't mentioned it, and I'm sure you've thought of it, but I don't think either mentioned it. He has based his whole composition on a temperature contrast between the warmth of the reds and the coolness of the greens, which is just as diametric as what we were saying.
We haven't even mentioned the color organization of the thing either. You mentioned earlier the dominance of red on the left-hand side, and there is a kind of shape, isn't there, made by red. And in this case, it has a kind of triangular character, the broad red base at the bottom and then the tapering of the red at the top. And if you look at the green, for example, in her sleeve, the yellow green and the green apple and the green curtain on the right, there's a kind of a counter triangle in green, so that in almost a symmetrical balancing of red and green, both at rather low intensities, with the red more higher intensity than the green. But oddly enough, in terms of the basic location, massing of the color into a kind of symmetrical play across maybe I'm exaggerating this. I sense at least a kind of a diagonal triangular red element on the left-hand side and a counter one in green on the right-hand side, balancing. Okay.